All right. Welcome everyone. This is about 10 o'clock, 10:03 right now in Toronto, and today's our webinar with the senior associate lawyer from Grant Spiegel in Toronto to talk about the immigration trends and updates in Canada. And welcome Christina Guida. And this is not the first time Christina is in our meeting room. We had our last update. I think it was a couple months ago with Christina. Gave us a lot of information. So today we're just very happy to have you back because the immigration policies are going, creating all those changes on a daily basis. So we have a lot of students who are here or who will be listening to this video in the future. They're experiencing a lot of questions and concerns about coming to Canada, study, work in Canada, or even like apply for a PR status in Canada. So today we're very happy to have you back. Christian, do you want to say hi to everybody? And we'll get it started.
Thank you, Brian. So hello, everyone. Nice to speak to you all again. And thank you for having me on today to talk about the various updates. So as you discussed before, Brian, there are several updates that have happened since the last time we spoke to each other, and I think that was sometime in the summer. So there's a few things that have to catch up on. Most specifically, most of the changes came into effect on October 20th. So our timing of this seminar and webinar is fantastic because they literally just published the updates last night. So I was frantically trying to understand what they were for today's discussion. So I'm glad we had it. So, I mean, in terms of what's changed since the last time we spoke and what's, on the agenda for students, essentially the travel bans are still in effect. So what that means is, as we discussed before, only very exceptional cases are allowed to travel to Canada. So things aren't open the way they were before. Priority is being given to family members, reuniting family members, workers who are dealt with in critical infrastructures. And what I was very happy about, and I'm sure all of us here today will be happy about, is they're starting to give priority and recognition to the importance of students, specifically because school just started in September. So one of the things that they did in the summer was that they did a two-step process where essentially they started working on the processing of study permits, and they did that in recognition that classes would be starting sometime in September. So there was a policy in place up until September 15th of 2020, where essentially students who submitted their applications and there was a completeness check, they had everything, they were processing them, and then provided they were able to do their biometrics, their medicals, and they had an updated passport and that kind of stuff, they were able to come into Canada well, essentially their applications were getting processed, essentially. So that happened, but now that program is closed because the idea is whoever was able to submit their applications and was eligible to study, that's happened. Okay, so then on October 20th, the government introduced a new policy where essentially if you have a study permit approval, you have a study permit in hand, a study permit approval, you're able to travel to Canada provided that your school is on the DLI, so that's the Designated Learning Institution list, and that there's a separate list where essentially your DLI has a COVID-19 readiness policy. So what that means is if there's an outbreak in the campus, or if there's someone does end up testing positive at the campus, what do they have in place to try and minimize the effect on the public? So if your school is there, then you're able to travel to Canada, which is fantastic news. So essentially, these are all the students basically that are being processed from March when the travel ban came into place till essentially September. And this is allowing them now, if they have that study permit in place and they weren't able to travel before, or if they have that study permit approval in hand, they're now able to come to Canada to study. So that's really positive news for everybody. Now, the key thing here is to make sure that your school is on that designated learning institute list. So there's a specific link on the government's website. Check that before you make plans to travel to Canada. That's what I'm basically telling all my clients. The other thing to be mindful of is when you're coming to Canada, you have to make sure that you have that study permit approval in hand, okay? So that's one of the things you have to be mindful of. And you have to make sure that you have your acceptance letter from the DLI Institute. So before, when you were coming to the border, all you had to show was the study permit approval, you were good to go. But now the border officials want to see what school you're attending, because they will confirm at that point if it's on that designated list. And the CBSA has essentially put a disclaimer on their website to say, you may make it, you know, you might be able to board the plane, but you may be turned away at the border if your school isn't on the list. So make sure you look at that before you come. So that's fantastic. So students coming in, that approval letter or the study permit, acceptance from the DLI, and then they're going to have to provide proof that they have sufficient funds for their studies, for the duration of their studies. Again, it's just an added level of assessment that the officers are doing. Again, because of COVID-19, because job markets are what they are at the time being, they want to make sure that students have enough money, at least for the initial period of time, specifically when they're quarantining. So that's another thing to be very mindful of. Students have to have a quarantine plan in place when they're arriving in Canada. So anyone arriving from Canada, all travelers, Canadians, permanent residents, foreign nationals are required to quarantine for a 14-day period. So when the students are coming to Canada, they should have their quarantine plan in place. So that includes where they're going to be staying, how the transportation from basically the airport to their place of quarantine or their residence. And they have to make sure that they've put in place, you know, if they're getting an Uber, a taxi, if they have a car rental, that's already put in place. And then you've made arrangements for, you know, getting contactless groceries and necessities of, you know, other necessities such as, you know, medication, stuff like that. Because the idea is from the airport to your place of quarantine, you wait those 14 days. Once those 14 days are up, you can go ahead. So that's something else to be mindful of. And another great update since the last time we spoke is that the immediate family members of students are actually able to travel with them at the initial period of time. So let's say, you know, someone has a spouse and the spouse wants to come in, they essentially can come with the student, provided that obviously they have the necessary visa and ETA application approved, and they have to be able to demonstrate to the CBSA officer that their visit to Canada is non-optional. And what that means is you can't just accompany the student at this point. You have to provide proof that, you know, you're going to help them settle in to their home of residence. You're going to be coming into Canada to work to help support them. So the idea is that, you know, you guys are a unit in the sense of you're going to be helping each other during this period of time that you're here in Canada. So that's another positive update and everything that's gone on since the last time we spoke. So that's a positive.
Just to interrupt here. So you have mentioned a DLI, which is a designated learning institute. So I know when people apply to schools in Canada, you know, there's many schools on the DLI list. So this particular list you mentioned is actually the COVID allowed institutions.
Yes.
So it's not everyone, it's not every school, it's only 10 or 20 or something.
Exactly. So I mean, the IRCC website is fantastic because it's just a simple Google search, you know, COVID-19 DLI, and the link will be there. So before you make your travel arrangements, make sure that the school is on that list. Because again, if it's not there, then you won't be able to travel.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually very good news, because a lot of people are still waiting. Well, they're not waiting. They're attending school online from home. You know, not the greatest, but at least they still got a chance to actually study with their classmates, with the school.
Exactly.
So now finally they can make their trip plan. If they want to, they can make their. So is it mandatory for them to actually come here, or it's actually okay, you can choose?
Well, it's not mandatory, but what we have to be mindful of is when it comes to the postgraduate work permit. So I know we're going to be
Right.
skipping a bit ahead of that. So, I mean, the good news is if you want to come to Canada, you're able to, provided you meet those requirements.
Hmm.
If for whatever reason you can't travel, either because, you can't afford it right now, because I can understand, it's great if you could live at home and do some of your studies at home as opposed to coming to Canada, if you're
Yeah.
able to do, the online studies. So that's fantastic. You can do that. But so you either come here or you continue your studies abroad online. But what you have to make sure that you understand is you have to maintain so you should have your study permit, okay, or have applied for the study permit in order for that that work to count, or those studies to count, essentially,
Right. Right.
for the future. Okay, because most people, why are they studying in Canada, is to get their postgraduate work permit, and then that's a pathway to permanent residency.
Hmm.
So we can't lose sight of that when you're making plans in terms of whether to stay home or to come to Canada. So with that in mind, you can continue to study abroad if you have a study permit or you've applied for a study permit, okay? And then hopefully the study permit will come into, it'll be approved at some point. But in order for you to be eligible for your post-grad work permit, you can continue to do your studies. 50% can be online, okay, and a distance, so distance studies, I guess, so back home, your country of residence. But then the other half of your studies in Canada, or your other half of your studies or your Canadian studies, have to physically be in Canada for that, okay, for the postgraduate work permit eligibility. So that's something to be mindful of. So you'll decide, I guess, each student will decide when it makes the most sense for them to come to Canada. If you're doing, a 2-year degree or diploma at a college, essentially you've already used up one of your years, by the time the next semester comes through. So that's something to be mindful of.
The one follow-up question I have for you, Christina, is that, so you mentioned that students can come here, basically if they've got a study permit approval. But when you said study permit approval, did you mean a formal letter confirming you've been granted?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not those people who got their stage 1 approval, because right now there's stage 1, stage 2, so I'm not quite sure what that means.
Yeah, so the stage 1, stage 2 approval is essentially, that was for people pre, I guess, September 15th. That's what was there. So they got the stage 1, they said, okay, you can continue to study. Now the issue that they're saying you have a temporary acceptance, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But as of today's date, that's still not, that's not in place anymore, because basically that stage 1, stage 2 was to help facilitate basically the September 2020 start date.
Right.
So to get as many students as possible into Canada to start studying, and then that way, they could, resume. Because I mean, at the end of the day, the Canadian government understands how critical students are to, immigration, to the economy, to all of that. So, I mean, they're in a tricky place because they're trying to, and there is criticism, but I think they're trying to do the best they can in terms of, balancing, public health versus, immigration. So they're trying to do their best. And it's understood that, having a student and approving a study permit right now, they could do that and then continue their studies while they're here in Canada. But I think come January, when the next, natural progression of a new term happens, I have a feeling they're going to do that step 1, step 2 processing again. Because today's disclaimer, or today's update that they did on the Government of Canada's website, essentially said there's no special initiatives right now for processing for study permits. So it's basically, it'll take as long as it has to take. And then I'm sure come probably December for the January term, or sometime in November for the January term, they'll probably introduce something else to help expedite it. Because the number one challenge in a lot of countries is a lot of people have to do biometrics. So outside of Canada, biometrics have to be done, medicals, and police clearance certificates if that's necessary. So a
Mhm.
lot of those facilities globally have been closed, specifically in individual countries, depending on how they're dealing with the pandemic. So
Right.
um, it's about balancing and seeing who they can allow through,
Mhm.
to come to Canada. But I mean, if the student has applied for their study permit,
Yeah.
and that's the key, because the government's recognize that if they've applied for their study permit, the time that they're studying right now, provided that there's a study permit in place and it's in process, will count ultimately when it comes to the postgraduate work permit, if the study permit is approved.
Mhm. So you mentioned so stage one, stage two is that if I understand correctly, right now people are still for people who got their stage one approval. I guess the only option for them right now is to wait for stage two to be approved. So they're not really in the category of being granted the study a permit approval.
No,
So the only option for them to kind of attend school is study online from home until
exactly.
further approval on the stage two option.
Exactly. And
Okay.
basically, the government has said that this policy, so essentially the studies online, the postgraduate eligibility, all of that is essentially in place until April of 2021. So that's in recognition of, first of all, from a COVID-19 perspective, that's probably when we're going to see things, if they improve, actually improve,
Yeah.
from the virus perspective. But it's also an understanding, again, to understanding the terms in school. So typically, the terms will end in college and university come April or June.
Hmm.
So April, May, June is usually when they end. So it's an understanding that they'll revisit things come that period of time.